Sarah adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag and clutched her boarding pass a little tighter. The hum of Los Angeles International Airport buzzed around her, but she barely registered it. Her mind was fixated on one thing: her elderly beagle, Toby. The vet had promised to send the final test results before her flight, but there was still no update. Each time she refreshed her email, she was met with silence. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to breathe. It's going to be okay. He's strong. But no matter how many times she told herself that, the gnawing fear didn't leave. Brushing a stray curl from her forehead, Sarah moved toward the boarding gate. She wasn't looking for attention. She never did. But she could feel the stares, subtle, passing glances from strangers who assumed she wouldn't notice. The ones who took just a little too long to look away. The silent whispers. She had dealt with it her whole life. She sighed and pulled her sweater around her body as she reached the gate, handing her boarding pass to the flight attendant. The woman's smile was mechanical, the kind that wasn't meant to be warm, just professional. But the moment her eyes flickered over Sarah's body, that professionalism cracked, if only for a second. There was an unmistakable pause, a subtle hesitation. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. "Enjoy your flight," the woman said, handing back her ticket with a tone that sounded like she meant the exact opposite. Sarah ignored it. She had long since learned that there was no use in reacting. People would be people, and if she let every passing judgment ruin her day, she'd never get through life. She stepped onto the plane, carefully maneuvering through the narrow aisle, her heart pounding. The seats felt even smaller than she remembered. Her fingers brushed against the armrests as she passed by, conscious of how little space there was. Please let no one say anything. Then it happened. A passenger sighed loudly as she moved past. "Great," a man in business attire muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Just what we needed." Sarah's stomach clenched. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She had heard variations of that comment 1,000 times before. She bit her lip and kept walking. Just a few more steps. Almost there. Then, as she tried to settle into her seat, the flight attendant from earlier returned. She leaned in, lowering her voice, but not enough to be private. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Sarah blinked. "Yes. 24B. The woman's smile returned, but it was sharper now. "It's just, we want to ensure all passengers are comfortable. Would you prefer a different arrangement?" It was a polite way of saying, "You're too big for this seat." Sarah felt the heat creep up her neck. A few passengers had turned to watch. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. "No," she said quietly. "I'm fine here." The attendant hesitated, as if waiting for Sarah to change her mind. When she didn't, the woman nodded stiffly and turned away. Sarah exhaled slowly. She could feel the embarrassment burning in her chest. The tension in her muscles wouldn't ease. She adjusted herself in the seat, making sure not to disturb the man beside her, even though he was already angled away, as if being too close to her was an inconvenience. She pressed her forehead against the window and closed her eyes, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the stifling weight of shame pressing down on her. She didn't notice that someone else had been watching, someone who had witnessed everything. Keanu Reeves, sitting just a few rows away, had been listening, observing. And he wasn't going to let this slide. Sarah kept her eyes glued to the window, hoping the pressure in her chest would fade. But it didn't. The embarrassment still clung to her like an unwelcome weight, and she could feel the judging eyes around her. The man in the seat next to her exhaled sharply and shifted uncomfortably, making a point to angle his body as far away as possible. It wasn't subtle, and Sarah knew exactly what it meant. She swallowed hard. It never got easier. Just as she thought she had found a moment of peace, a voice rang out. "Excuse me." The same flight attendant from earlier had returned, standing just beside her row with a strained smile. Sarah's stomach twisted. Not again. She turned slowly, dreading whatever was about to happen next. "Ma'am," The attendant continued, this time speaking even more softly, as if that made it any less humiliating. Some of our passengers have raised concerns about space. We just want to ensure everyone's comfort. Sarah blinked. Passengers, or just the ones who had decided she didn't belong here? She could feel the lump forming in her throat, but she refused to let it show. I'm in my assigned seat. I paid for this seat. I'm not bothering anyone. The woman's polite mask didn't slip, but something about her expression hardened. Of course, we understand, but we do have some extra seating options if you'd like more room. Sarah knew exactly what was happening. They wanted her to move. It wasn't an offer. It was an attempt to make her feel out of place until she gave in. She turned to the man sitting next to her. He wasn't even hiding his annoyance now, shaking his head as if this was all some grand inconvenience. Just let it go, Sarah. That little voice in her head told her to comply, to just accept it so she could get through the flight. But another part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime shrinking herself to make others comfortable, had had enough. No, thank you, she said, her voice firm. The flight attendant's brows lifted slightly, as if surprised that she had the audacity to refuse. You're sure? I can check if there's. I'm sure, Sarah said, cutting her off. There was a beat of silence. The air around them felt thick. And then, a voice from across the aisle shattered it. Is there a problem here? The moment Sarah turned toward the voice, she almost did a double take. Keanu Reeves, sitting just a few rows over, leaning slightly into the aisle, his dark eyes locked onto the flight attendant. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakable. The entire section of the plane fell silent. Sarah felt her breath catch. She hadn't even realized he was on the flight. The flight attendant blinked, clearly flustered, but quickly recovered. Oh, no problem at all, sir, she said with a small laugh. We're just ensuring all passengers are comfortable. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making one passenger very uncomfortable. Sarah's eyes widened. The flight attendant hesitated. I assure you, we're just trying to accommodate. She already has a seat, Keanu said calmly, but there was an unmistakable steel in his voice. And if anyone has a problem with that, maybe they should be the ones to move. A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby passengers. Sarah's cheeks burned, but this time, it wasn't just embarrassment, it was shock. Was this actually happening? The man next to her cleared his throat and suddenly seemed a lot more interested in his in-flight magazine. The flight attendant's smile tightened. Of course, sir. If there's anything else I can do for you, let me know. She turned on her heel and walked away, her steps a little stiffer than before. Sarah felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. She didn't know what to say. Keanu gave her a small nod before turning back in his seat. Just like that, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. For the first time in a long time, someone had stood up for her. Not just anyone. Keanu Reeves. The weight in her chest lightened, just a little. The flight continued, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Sarah sat still in her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The incident had passed, but the aftershocks remained. She could feel the curious glances, the hushed murmurs from the passengers behind her, the weight of their judgment still pressing down on her shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in that weight. Keanu Reeves had spoken up for her. She stole a glance in his direction. He sat a few rows ahead, relaxed in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just completely changed the trajectory of her day, maybe even her life. She wanted to say something. Thank him, maybe. Acknowledge what he had done. But her throat felt tight, and instead, she turned back to the window, trying to steady her breath. The plane rumbled as the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing that they'd be reaching cruising altitude soon. Flight attendants began their rounds again, their polite smiles fixed in place, as if nothing had happened. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. She could still feel the tension in her limbs, the adrenaline from the confrontation refusing to fade. It's over now. Just get through the flight. And then, a quiet voice beside her. Hey. She turned, startled. Keanu Reeves stood in the aisle, a soft, easy smile on his face. For a second, Sarah thought she was imagining it. You okay? He asked, his voice calm, patient. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at him, her brain short-circuiting. Keanu Reeves, was speaking to her, checking in on her. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to regain some composure. Yeah, I'm fine. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. He didn't look convinced. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. Okay, not fine, but I'll be okay. Keanu nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Can I sit? He asked, gesturing to the empty aisle seat across from her. Sarah blinked. Was this real life? She nodded before she could second-guess herself. He settled into the seat effortlessly, leaning slightly toward her so their conversation wouldn't disturb the other passengers. You handled that well, he said. Sarah scoffed. I didn't do anything. You handled it. You didn't let them push you around, Keanu countered. That takes strength. Sarah looked away, not sure how to respond to that. It didn't feel like strength. It felt like survival. Keanu was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. People don't always realize how hard it is. She turned back to him. How hard what is? His gaze was steady, being seen but not being seen. The words hit harder than Sarah expected, because that was exactly how it felt. People saw her size. They saw what they wanted to see, but they never really saw her. She swallowed, her voice quieter now. Yeah, it's hard. Keanu nodded. I get it. Sarah frowned slightly. Do you? She didn't mean it to sound rude, but she couldn't help the skepticism in her voice. How could someone like him possibly understand? Keanu smiled, an almost sad, knowing smile. More than you'd think. Sarah studied him. The world knew him as an A-list actor, one of the most beloved people in Hollywood. He was rich, famous, adored by millions. What could he possibly struggle with? He must have noticed the doubt in her expression because he leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping absently against his knee. I spent a long time being seen the wrong way, he said finally. People think they know you. They create stories in their heads about who you are, but they don't know you. Sarah's breath caught. She had spent her whole life being misjudged, assumed to be lazy, unhealthy, less than. Keanu had spent his life being idolized, turned into a legend, but neither of them had been truly seen. That's why I said something. Keanu continued, his voice gentle but firm. Because I know how much it sucks to have people decide your worth for you. Sarah's throat felt tight again, but for a different reason now. She looked down at her hands. Thank you, she said, barely above a whisper. Keanu shook his head. No thanks needed. Just don't forget, you deserve to be here just as much as anyone else. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in a long time, she started to believe it. Keanu stood, giving her a nod before returning to his seat. Sarah watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The flight continued on, but Sarah knew this wasn't just another plane ride. This was something much bigger. And somehow, she had a feeling Keanu Reeves wasn't done surprising her yet. Sarah sat in her seat, staring at the back of Keanu Reeves' head, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Did that really just happen? The man, the legend, who had been in countless movies, who was adored by millions, had stood up for her. Not just that. He had taken the time to talk to her, to understand her, to remind her of something she had long since forgotten. She had worth. She belonged. The weight of it settled in her chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. It felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't drowning in the judgment of others. Instead, she was floating in the kindness of one man who had simply seen her. And then the flight attendant returned. Sarah tensed immediately. She had hoped that after the public humiliation, the woman would leave her alone. That maybe she had learned her lesson. But the look in the flight attendant's eyes told her otherwise. This wasn't over. "Miss," she said, forcing another one of those plastic smiles, "I hope everything is okay now." Sarah narrowed her eyes. There was something behind that tone, a fake sweetness, laced with something sharper. "It is," she said simply, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing her uncomfortable. The flight attendant didn't seem pleased with that response. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I understand this has been a bit of a situation," she said, her tone overly polite. "But we do have policies about." Before she could finish, a new voice cut in. "I think she's made it clear she's fine." Sarah turned sharply, so did the flight attendant. Keanu Reeves was standing in the aisle again. The tension in the air thickened instantly. The flight attendant's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. "Mr. Reeves, I heard you," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "And I also heard her say she's fine. So unless there's an actual reason to bother her again, I think we're done here." Sarah watched, wide-eyed, as the flight attendant's face turned an interesting shade of pink. She sputtered for a second, looking between the two of them, before finally muttering something under her breath and walking away. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Keanu turned to her, a small smirk playing at his lips. "You okay?" She laughed, shaking her head. "You really don't have to keep checking on me." He shrugged. "Old habit. I don't like bullies." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Yeah," she murmured. "Me neither." Keanu nodded toward the empty aisle seat beside her. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "You want to sit here?" He grinned. "Why not?" She hesitated for a second before nodding. "Be my guest." Keanu slid into the seat, resting an elbow on the armrest. "So," he said casually, "where are you headed?" Sarah blinked at him. She hadn't expected him to strike up a normal conversation. "New York," she answered. "Going home." He nodded. "Nice city." She gave a half-hearted shrug. "It's all right." Keanu tilted his head. "That doesn't sound very convincing." Sarah sighed. "It used to feel like home. Lately, I don't know. Feels different." Keanu studied her for a moment. "Because of people." Sarah let out a dry chuckle. "You mean people like her?" she said, nodding toward the flight attendant. Keanu gave a small smile. "Maybe." Sarah exhaled, resting her chin on her hand. "People have always had an opinion about me, about what I should or shouldn't be. They don't even know me, but somehow, they think they do." Keanu nodded as if he completely understood. "That's the world for you. Full of people who think they know better." Sarah shook her head, staring down at her hands. "I used to let it roll off my back. But lately, I don't know. It feels heavier." Keanu leaned back, looking thoughtful. "Maybe it's because you've spent so much time carrying it alone." Sarah stilled. She hadn't thought of it that way before. But he was right. She had been carrying this weight for years, silently, without help. And for the first time, someone was standing beside her, sharing the burden. She glanced at him. "How do you deal with it?" Keanu let out a slow breath. "I remind myself that most people don't know anything. They see what they want to see. It's not my job to change their minds. It's just my job to be me." Sarah swallowed hard. She had spent her whole life trying to be less noticeable, less of a burden, less of whatever people thought she was. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe she didn't need to be less. Maybe she just needed to be her. For the first time, she allowed that thought to settle. Maybe, just maybe, she was enough. The flight continued on, but Sarah knew something had changed. And it had nothing to do with the flight attendant, the passengers, or their judgment. It had everything to do with the man sitting beside her. Keanu Reeves had done the unthinkable. He had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten: her worth. And somehow she had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Sarah leaned back in her seat, glancing at Keanu Reeves beside her, still unable to believe he was actually sitting there, talking to her as if they were old friends. It wasn't just his fame that made it surreal. It was the way he made her feel seen. Not like a spectacle, not like a burden, just a person. She had spent so many years bracing herself for the worst in people, expecting the judgment before it even came, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply treat her normally. "So, what do you do?" Keanu asked, his tone casual. Sarah hesitated. It was a simple question, but it still felt loaded. "I'm a writer," she admitted, almost shyly. Keanu's eyebrows lifted in interest. "Really?" She shrugged. "Well, I mean, sort of. I do freelance work, articles, blog posts, that kind of thing. But I want to write novels, real stories, the kind that make people feel something." Keanu smiled. "That's a good dream." Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. "Dream, sure. Reality, not so much. I keep starting things and never finishing. I second-guess myself a lot." Keanu studied her for a moment. "Why?" Sarah hesitated, staring down at her hands. I don't know if I'm good enough." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Who gets to decide that?" Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Keanu gestured with his hands. "Who decides if you're good enough? Some publisher? Random readers? The voice in your head?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. "The only person who gets to decide if your writing is good enough is you." Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "That's easy for you to say. You're Keanu Reeves. You've already made it." Keanu chuckled. "You think I never doubted myself?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" He nodded. "All the time. When I was younger, I had people tell me I'd never make it as an actor, that I wasn't Hollywood enough, that I wasn't what people wanted." Sarah's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Keanu nodded. "And you know what? I almost believed them. Almost. But then I realized I didn't have to be what they wanted. I just had to be me." Sarah swallowed hard. That hit deeper than she expected. She had spent her entire life trying to fit into a world that made it clear she wasn't what people wanted. She had shrunk herself, hidden parts of herself, let the fear of judgment keep her from going after what she truly wanted. But what if she didn't have to be what they wanted? What if she just had to be her? She let out a shaky breath. "You make it sound so simple." Keanu smiled. "It's not simple, but it's worth it." Sarah looked down at her lap, her fingers twisting together. "I don't even know where to start." Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the backpack he had stowed under his seat and pulled out a small, worn-out notebook. He flipped to a blank page and tore it out. Then he grabbed a pen, scribbled something down, and handed the page to her. Sarah frowned, looking at the words written in Keanu's messy, hurried handwriting. "Just start." She blinked up at him. "That's it." Keanu grinned. "That's everything." Sarah stared at the page, something shifting inside her. All her life, she had been waiting for permission, waiting for someone to tell her she was good enough, that she was allowed to take up space, that she was allowed to chase her dreams. But she didn't need permission. She just needed to start. She folded the piece of paper carefully, tucking it into her pocket like a precious secret. Keanu sat back, satisfied. "So, what's your novel about?" Sarah exhaled. "I don't know yet." Keanu smirked. "Then I guess you have some writing to do." Sarah smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. For once, she didn't feel stuck. She didn't feel small. She felt ready. And as the plane continued its journey toward New York, Sarah knew This wasn't just another flight. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something she wasn't afraid of anymore. Sarah sat in her seat, fingers tracing the edges of the note Keanu Reeves had given her. Just start. 2 simple words, but they held more power than anything she had told herself in years. The plane hummed softly as it glided through the sky, the cabin dim now as some passengers dozed off. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of how small their problems seemed compared to the vastness of the world. Sarah wasn't sure how long she had been staring at that piece of paper when Keanu spoke again. "So, tell me something," he said, shifting slightly in his seat to face her. "If you could write about anything, without worrying about whether it's good enough, what would it be?" Sarah hesitated. The words bubbled in her throat, but something about saying them out loud felt like admitting to a dream she had buried long ago. I think I'd write about people who feel invisible," she finally said. "The ones the world doesn't pay attention to. The ones people overlook, judge too quickly, or never take the time to understand." Keanu's eyes softened. "Sounds like something the world needs." Sarah let out a small laugh. "Yeah, well, people don't exactly line up to read about someone like me." Keanu tilted his head. "And yet here we are." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured between them. "You're telling your story right now, and I'm listening." Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't used to being listened to. Not like this. Not in a way that made her feel like she mattered. A sudden wave of emotions threatened to rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. Keanu smiled. "That's the best part. You get to decide." Sarah exhaled, staring down at her lap. Could it really be that simple? For years, she had let her fear dictate everything. Fear of being judged. Fear of failing. Fear of never being enough. But sitting here, thousands of feet above the world, talking to a man who had every reason to ignore her but chose not to, something shifted. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect. Maybe she just had to start. Keanu must have sensed her thoughts because he leaned forward slightly. "Can I tell you a secret?" Sarah glanced at him, curiosity sparking in her chest. "Sure." He smirked. "Every time I start a new role, I still get nervous." Sarah's eyes widened. "Seriously? You?" He nodded. "Yep. Doesn't matter how many movies I've done, how many years I've been in this business. That little voice in my head still whispers, 'What if this time you mess it all up?'" Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. If Keanu Reeves still had self-doubt, then maybe it wasn't about getting rid of fear altogether. Maybe it was about moving forward despite it. Keanu leaned back in his seat, arms resting comfortably on the armrests. "But you know what I tell that voice?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What?" He grinned. "I say, thanks for your input. Now sit down and watch what happens." Sarah burst into laughter before she could stop herself. Something about that line, so simple, so confident, made her feel lighter. Maybe her self-doubt would never go away completely. But maybe she didn't have to listen to it anymore. She tapped her fingers against the folded note in her hand, staring at it for a long moment. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Keanu watched in amusement. "What are you doing?" Sarah flipped to a blank page, gripping her pen. "I'm starting." Keanu's smile widened. Good choice. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest. Hope. The conclusion. Sarah's pen hovered over the blank page in her notebook. For years, she had stared at empty pages, waiting for the courage to fill them. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't waiting for permission. This time, she was starting. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between her and Keanu, who was watching her with quiet amusement. His presence was reassuring, not overpowering, not demanding, just there. Sarah exhaled slowly and placed the pen to paper. The words didn't have to be perfect. They just had to exist. Keanu leaned slightly toward her. "What are you writing?" Sarah smirked. "Wouldn't you like to know?" He chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough." She hesitated before glancing at him. "It's about today, about people, about how we never really know what someone else is going through." Keanu nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a story worth telling." Sarah's chest tightened. For so long, she had let the world tell her she didn't matter, that her voice didn't deserve to be heard. But here was a man, one of the most famous in the world, telling her otherwise. For the first time, she believed it. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged overhead, signaling that they were beginning their descent. A part of Sarah felt reluctant. She didn't want this moment to end. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt whole. And soon, she would have to return to reality. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing at JFK Airport shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened." Passengers around them began stirring, stretching, gathering their belongings. Sarah closed her notebook, but kept it close to her chest. Keanu shifted beside her. "You know," he said, his tone casual, "I meant what I said earlier." Sarah looked at him, confused. "Which part?" He smirked. "All of it." She shook her head with a smile. "You're going to have to be more specific." Keanu exhaled, glancing at her thoughtfully. "The world will always have something to say. You can let them decide who you are, or you can decide for yourself." Sarah's throat tightened. For years, she had let others write her story. It was time to take the pen back. The plane landed smoothly, rolling down the runway as the passengers clapped. Something Sarah had always found funny, as if the pilot needed validation for doing his job. Keanu stretched and turned to her. "Got any plans once you land?" Sarah bit her lip. "Well, first, I need to check on my dog. He's been sick." Keanu's expression softened. "I hope he's okay." Sarah nodded. "Me too." She paused before adding, "And after that, I think I'm going to write." Keanu's smile was slow but warm. "Good." The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin erupted into movement. People reached for overhead compartments, stretching into the aisles. Sarah hesitated. Keanu seemed to notice because he stayed seated, watching the crowd thin out before turning to her. "Want to walk out together?" Her breath hitched slightly at the kindness in his voice. She wasn't used to people waiting for her, but today had been full of surprises. She nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." They walked off the plane together, side by side. Sarah didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. And as they stepped into the airport, Keanu glanced at her with a smirk. "Hey, when your book gets published, save me a signed copy." Sarah laughed, warmth blooming in her chest. "You got it." And with that, she walked forward, not just into the airport, but into the next chapter of her life.